Before we get started today, I want to make an announcement. We have a Lightroom class that we are going to start teaching virtually through Cardinal Camera. That class has been the most popular class at the store by miles. We have had gosh, we probably have had a couple hundred people go through that class at the store. So what we're going to do now is offer that class online, and we'll connect through an online meeting to where you will actually see my computer screen that would be exactly like what you would see in the store on the display. And then we will run the class exactly the same way, and we don't need to connect and be socially connected at the store. So we're going to do virtual connection. If you're interested in that, you can contact me. I can get you set up with a class. I'll message it over to Cardinal, or you can just call Cardinal Camera directly and set it up through them. And I'm sure we'll run it a handful of times because it's always sold out every time we do it. And I'm going to keep the classes quite small while we're getting started with the virtual side of things, just to make sure that I can get everybody the attention that they need and to make sure that that works well for everybody. So the first couple of times that we're running it, we'll probably just do it with maybe 5 or 6 people. I will do some other classes through there too. Some of the other popular ones that I've done, we can certainly run them right through the same system. All right, into our main topics for today. So as I promised yesterday, we're going to do 2 things each day. The first thing is a technical thing, and today that technical thing is aperture. And then the non-technical thing, we're going to talk about the compositional element of the rule of thirds. All right, so aperture. The definition of aperture is opening. So it's the size of the opening of the blades inside your lens. And the one tricky thing about aperture, and it's sometimes people stumble over this, especially if they're learning on their own without a teacher, the numbers that represent the aperture actually run the opposite of what is intuitive. So your smallest aperture of a lens is actually the highest number represented on the lens. So this particular lens actually has a ring to change the aperture. And you spin the ring, and at one end it's 1.4. So that's an f-stop number. That's what they call it, is the f-stop. So the f-stop 1.4 is a huge opening. It's the blades inside the camera are all the way open as far as they will go. If I spin this the other way, the smallest it goes is the highest number, and for this particular lens, that's f16. Now, some lenses will go higher. Some will go to f22 or f32. They can go up really high. 1.4 is almost as low as that number will go, almost as big of an aperture as you'll generally ever see. There are some f1.2 and even a rare f1 lens, but they're super, super rare and very expensive. So more likely, if you're shooting with a lens that came with your camera in a kit, it will be the lowest number that you can go to is going to be higher than a 1.4. It might be 2.8, or it might be 3.5 or a 4 or something like that. It's going to vary by lens. And so one thing that's very helpful to know is that the aperture setting is not a function of your camera body, it's a function of your lens. So when you change lenses, the aperture capabilities change. So you might have one lens that can go to f1.4 or f1.8 and another lens that can only go to f5.6. So that's just the nature of how it works. So when you change your aperture, you're changing a thing called the depth of field. And basically what happens is when you have those blades open super, super wide, one of the optical effects that happen is that you're making a very, very narrow area of the out in front of your camera that will be in focus. So it makes it a razor thin area. If you're at 1.4, 1.8, you're going to have a tiny little slice of the world straight out in front of your lens that's in focus. If you go to the opposite extreme, if you go to f16, it's going to give you a very long range of stuff that's acceptably in focus. And so that is called your depth of field. And so when your number is higher, you have a bigger depth of field. When your number is lower, you have a narrower depth of field. All right, so that is what today is all about. That's what you're going to experiment with in shooting. So in order to do this without needing to learn a whole bunch of other controls, I'm going to have you just set your camera on aperture priority. On most cameras, there is a spinning dial up here on the top, and one of the choices on there is an A or AV. Right? Canon uses AV, that's aperture value. I think Nikon and Sony both use an A, and other camera bodies mostly use an A too. If you don't know what it is and you can't find it intuitively, you can just kind of do a Google search, Aperture Priority in Panasonic, Lumix, or whatever it is, and get your answer on how to get there. Once you're in Aperture Priority mode, you as the photographer are going to control aperture somehow, and you need to find out where that control is. On most cameras, you're going to have some spinning dials. You'll have a dial that your thumb can spin, or that your index finger can spin, or even the spinning dial in the back. One of those is going to be connected to your aperture setting in your camera, and you want to find that. Again, if you can't find it, you can just do a YouTube, just search a video and use your model number of your camera, and somebody will have explained, here's how to change aperture on, camera X. So once you know that, you're set, you're off and running. So what I want you to do is to explore on how changing that aperture setting affects the look of your photo. And once upon a time, I shot almost exclusively in manual. In manual, you have 3 settings that you have to control. You're controlling your aperture, but then you're also controlling your shutter speed and your ISO. And those 3 things are called the aperture triangle. And surprise, surprise, the next 2 days we're going to take the other 2 sides of the triangle. But today, we're just going to take aperture. So as camera bodies advance and they become better at making the computer choices of the other setting, I've actually kind of converted over to where I shoot in aperture priority a big majority of the time. I'd say probably 85% of the time I'm shooting in aperture priority. If I'm out doing landscape and I'm set up on a tripod and I'm taking forever to set up a shot, then I'll do that in full manual. If I'm shooting sports and I'm shooting something where I have to have a certain shutter speed to make it work, I would flip over and do the shutter priority. But for most portraiture, wedding work, event photography, which is the stuff that I tend to do most of, aperture priority is fast, it's easy, letting the camera have a little bit of the calculating work to do really takes some of the pressure off. So I have grown to like that after years of shooting in full manual. So I think you're going to like aperture priority. I think it's one that a lot of people who are not professional photographers, but they're hobbyists that really want to get great photos, people tend to really like this mode. So one thing that I want you to do when you're shooting today, so if you have kids at home or whatever it is that you're going to be photographing, one of the things I want you to do is to make sure that they're not too close to the wall behind them. So the way that I'm set up to do this video right now, I'm only about 1.5 feet in front of this wall. And so even with a very, very big aperture, which is a small depth of field, that wall's gonna still look relatively sharp. What I want you to do is to move your subject or to find a subject that's more like 6 or 8 feet away from a wall, and then make your aperture huge. Make it as big as your lens will go, and take pictures of that subject, and you'll see that the wall behind you blurs out. It's kind of the portrait mode in the iPhone where they try to make everything else in the back blurry. That's what they're emulating. That's what that setting is copying. We're just learning how to do it on a camera. And then flip that around when you're doing the small aperture, and you might need to step outside for this because you're going to need an area where there's more light. But if you go to a really small aperture, you're going to find a much, much deeper area. So if you're taking a picture of the mountain behind your house, or in my case, it's the train track behind the house, you basically, you go to that small aperture, which is the high number, and you get a bigger swath of the world in focus, and sometimes that's what you're looking to show in your image. So I'd like to see the images you create. I'd like to start sharing them out together. So you can pop into the Photographers Cooperative Facebook group. I will create a thread where people can share them. Or you can just send them to me in an email and ask me, what thoughts are on them, and I can give you feedback that way. So the main thing is that you're out doing something other than just sitting on your phone and reading those horrible news updates. So Have a great day. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about shutter speed.